In this video, I'm going to explain how you should write and how you should not write your methodology chapter. And at the end, I'll show you one example of good practice and one example of not so good practice. There is a much longer version of this video in the Virtual Tutor online resource, whose details are in the description below. Because we are talking about methodology, it's important to clarify what is the role of the methodology chapter. And the methodology chapter is where you explain what you've done in your attempt to answer research objectives. If you look at how a dissertation is structured, you start your journey by defining your aim and objectives at the beginning of the dissertation, in the introduction, and in the last chapter, in the conclusion, you summarize the answers to those research questions. And the methodology is where you explain the journey that you undertook in order to move from the introduction, the definition of objectives, to finding the answers. It involves clarifying the things that you've done and also why you've done them that way. One cool way of explaining what the methodology is about is by considering it as a journey with a starting point and an end point. And along the way, there are critical points that you need to consider. This also happens when you want to travel from point A to point B. You have to make many decisions along the way. And in the methodology, it's the same. You've got a starting point, which is your objectives, and you want to get to the destination, which is your conclusions. You want to find an answer to your objectives. So the critical reference point when designing your journey is answering the research questions. Research questions are a guiding star, if you want to call them that way, that should inform all the decisions that you make in your methodology chapter. And what should you write about when covering each critical point? It's actually a 4-step process, and you can employ this process for any section of your methodology. The first one is to acknowledge that there's a critical point. Once you've done that, you have to identify the alternatives. Once you identify the alternatives, you have to select an option. And once you select an option, you have to explain why you've gone for that option and not for other options. Let's look at 2 examples to see how this applies in practice. If we consider, for example, having to make a decision about the type of study, then what you would have to do is to identify the possible types of study, let's say qualitative or quantitative. Then you have to make your choice, for example, quantitative, and then you have to explain why you opted for quantitative for your study. And I'll come back to this later. Another example could be about the data collection strategy. So you have to identify alternatives, and you could use a survey or secondary data. Then you have to select an option from the alternatives, such as a survey. And if survey is your choice, then you have to explain why they were chosen for your study. And you can do this process for any section, any decision, any critical point of your methodology. By doing it, you basically address 2 important questions of the methodology: what you've done and what you've not done, and explaining why you've done it that way. This is the essence of the methodology, as I explained, and this process allows you to address that important reference point for the methodology. We've just seen that explaining your choice is a critical element of the process. But how do you explain your methodological choices? There are actually 6 possible reasons you can use to explain your choices. The first one is aim and objectives. And in fact, many explanations are provided in relation to these. As I explained, you've got a goal, which is to answer the research objectives, and the methodology is where you explain how you got there. So it is important that a lot of the explanations refer back to the objectives. And this reason is also important because it helps you to address one of the 6 C's of academic writing excellence. In this instance, the confined C, which means that whatever you write sits within the boundaries of the research. A link to the video on the 6 C's of academic writing excellence is in the description below. The second reason you can use to explain your methodological choices is the conceptual framework. This is more applicable to quantitative research than qualitative, because in quantitative research, you are obliged to define variables and the relationship between them. In other words, define a conceptual framework before you start collecting your data. But it can also be used in qualitative research when very broad frameworks are employed. A third reason we can use to explain our methodological choices is past research. Here we go to studies that have already been published and learn from them with a view to make sure that we use methods that have been proven to work and reject methods that have been proven not to work so well. By learning from others' experiences, we can select what has been found to work well and avoid doing the same mistakes others have done. If you're enjoying this video, press the like button, and if you're not subscribed yet, consider subscribing. The fourth reason you can use to explain methodological choices is general method knowledge. And here you use the generic characteristics of an alternative to explain its use or its rejection. For example, when it comes to questionnaires, you can use the advantage of questionnaires to explain their choice, but you can also use their disadvantages to explain why you didn't use them. It's really important that we don't write about all the benefits and all the limitations of a methodological option. It is vital that we select key characteristics that makes their use recommended in our study. What were those key characteristics that really influenced the choices that we've made? And that's what you should write about. The fifth type of reason is the context of the research. And here you can explain methodological choices by, for example, explaining the characteristics of the participants in the study or the characteristics of the industry that you are focusing on. And these reasons provide a good basis as to why in our particular study we chose those options, those methodological options. For example, you may explain the choice of a particular type of professional in your study because the way the industry is structured. Or you may choose a certain type of company because of the characteristics of that company. The sixth and final reason that we can use to explain methodological choices are constraints. And this goes back to the ideal versus the possible. Sometimes we would like ideally to do something, but due to certain constraints being there, we cannot do what we would like to do. And therefore, we have to settle for a less desirable alternative. It doesn't mean it's not correct or it's not good. It's just that we ideally would like to get someone or do things in a different way, but it's not possible. And those constraints can be in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of access to equipment, or even access to participants. For example, maybe ideally you would like to carry out 20 interviews, but in the end you could only get 12 done. And you can explain this shortcoming based on lack of time or, for example, being unable to access enough participants. You don't have to use all the 6 reasons every single time. You have to use your judgment to select the reason or the combination of reasons that best explains why your methodological choice was appropriate for your study. Let's look at a good example before we look at a not so good example. This example comes from a dissertation that I supervised, and the paragraph here is good because it not only explains what was the methodological choice, but also why that choice was appropriate for the research. Let's break down the paragraph into sentences to see how this works in practice. So the first sentence goes to general methods knowledge, which states a characteristic of case studies, in this instance, that it is appropriate when understanding and exploring social phenomena. The second sentence applies that to the context of the research, claiming that workplaces are inherently social and social interaction in the workplace can influence organizational greening. And what the student did next was to conclude, to provide a conclusion, make the case for the use of case study as an appropriate method for exploring factors influencing corporate event greening. And actually from this sentence, you know what the research is about, factors influencing corporate event greening. The argument doesn't stop here because the student says, furthermore, an author states that case studies are of particular use when organizational and managerial processes are being studied. So again, a piece of information that comes from general methods knowledge sources. And then this is applied to the student's research. As seen in the literature review, these types of processes were likely to be evident in organizations. And then the student concludes with further highlighting the case study rationale. In other words, what she did, which was to adopt the case study approach. By adopting this writing style, I know exactly what this research is about, what the student tried to do, and why the student chose this methodological option, which is opposed to the example of not so good practice because, as you will see, there's no detail about the research. Everything is too abstract, too generic, too vague. The example of not so good practice comes from a dissertation that I second marked a few years ago. And it's not a good example because everything is so abstract, so generic. There's no purpose. I can't conclude from reading it, and there are two parts to this paragraph. I cannot conclude what the student did and certainly why the student did it that way. And these are the two main purposes of the methodology. So you should bear in mind that as you write yours, by following the good practice that I've showed in the previous example and avoiding the not so good practice that I'm showing you now. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to watch this one on qualitative research, which is where I explain how to find themes in qualitative data. But if you are doing quantitative research, I invite you to watch this one, which is where I provide valuable tips to improve your questionnaire.